The first ambulance hadn't even stopped rolling before another crashed through the emergency entrance behind it, its siren dissolving into the desperate chorus of voices echoing beneath the fluorescent lights. Blood streaked across polished tile, frightened relatives pressed against security barriers, and somewhere beyond the swinging trauma doors a physician shouted for more hands, more oxygen, more time than no one could possibly give. Standing almost unnoticed beside the admissions desk, Elena Carter tightened the laces of her plain white nursing shoes, clipped a simple identification badge to her scrub top, and stepped into the storm as though she had been expecting it all along. She looked nothing like the kind of person anyone imagined when they thought of extraordinary experience. Her dark hair was tied into a practical knot, her uniform carried no decorations beyond a small embroidered hospital logo, and the only personal item visible was an old silver watch whose scratched face suggested years of use rather than sentiment. She was the newest nurse on staff, hired only days earlier after transferring from a rural medical center that few people had ever heard of. Most of the nurses knew little more than her name, and what little they did know inspired little confidence. One whispered that she seemed too quiet for trauma care. Another assumed she had probably never seen a major emergency before. Someone else glanced at her employment file and shrugged, wondering why administration had filled such an important position with someone whose previous experience looked strangely incomplete. There were unexplained gaps, unusually brief descriptions of former assignments, and references that praised her without offering any details. In another situation, curiosity might have lingered. Tonight there was no time. Stretchers rolled past so quickly their wheels blurred. A paramedic stumbled through the entrance carrying an unconscious child while shouting blood pressure numbers that seemed to fall with every breath. Monitors beeped without rhythm. Phones rang unanswered. The emergency department had crossed the invisible line between busy and overwhelmed. Every available room was occupied, and patients were beginning to line the hallways. Elena accepted her first assignment without complaint, kneeling beside an elderly woman whose hands trembled uncontrollably beneath a thermal blanket. Instead of rushing immediately toward the visible injuries, she paused for less than a second, studying the woman's breathing, the color beneath her fingernails, the tiny movement of muscles around her jaw. Her fingers settled gently against the patient's wrist. Her expression never changed, but she immediately asked for a portable ultrasound instead of additional pain medication. The attending resident frowned. The woman had obvious fractures. An ultrasound seemed unnecessary. Elena simply repeated the request, her voice calm enough that it almost disappeared beneath the surrounding chaos. A few minutes later the scan revealed internal bleeding that had not yet appeared in the initial examination. The room fell silent for a heartbeat before everyone rushed into motion. Surgery was notified. Minutes mattered now. No one thanked the new nurse because there was no time, but one experienced physician glanced toward her with the briefest flicker of curiosity. Across the hall another patient arrived unconscious after being trapped beneath twisted steel. Several nurses struggled to stabilize him, while alarms screamed from multiple monitors at once. Elena moved between beds without wasted motion, replacing empty oxygen cylinders before anyone noticed they were running low, catching a medication dosage that had nearly been entered incorrectly, comforting a terrified teenager whose repeated questions had gone unanswered simply because everyone else had been too busy trying to keep people alive. She never raised her voice. She never demanded attention. Yet somehow the frantic movement around her seemed to become more organized whenever she entered a room. Even so, assumptions lingered. During a brief exchange near the medication station, a senior nurse told Elena to remain with routine observations while experienced staff handled the complicated trauma cases. Elena nodded without argument. She accepted the instruction with the same quiet expression she wore for everything else. She did not explain that routine observations often revealed the difference between life and death. She simply continued watching. An hour later those observations saved another patient when she noticed a subtle swelling near a young construction worker's neck that suggested his airway would soon collapse. By the time others recognized the danger, emergency intervention had already begun because Elena had prepared everything in advance. Again, no explanation. Again, No recognition beyond puzzled looks exchanged between exhausted coworkers. Outside, rain hammered the ambulance bay, washing streaks of mud and gasoline toward overflowing drains. News helicopters circled somewhere beyond the clouds, broadcasting images of the massive highway collision that had transformed an ordinary evening into a regional disaster. Police radios crackled continuously. Dispatch warned that more victims remained trapped. Inside the emergency department, every available hallway became temporary treatment space. Blankets covered chairs. 4 poles stood wherever there was room. Volunteers distributed water to frightened families whose faces reflected equal parts hope and dread. Near the pediatric waiting area, a little boy no older than 8 sat alone, hugging a worn blue backpack against his chest. His shoes were still dusty from the accident scene. Every few minutes he looked toward the trauma doors, searching every face that emerged. Nobody had time to explain what was happening. Nobody except Elena. As she hurried past, she slowed just enough to kneel beside him. She did not offer empty promises or rehearsed reassurance. She simply asked his father's name, listened carefully to the answer, and gently told him that people were working with everything they had because his father mattered. The child nodded without speaking, but his breathing slowed. When Elena stood again, she noticed something lying partially hidden beneath the chair where one of the newest accident victims had been placed. It was a damaged metal bracelet unlike ordinary medical identification. Its surface was scratched and stained, but one small engraved symbol remained visible beneath the blood. Her eyes rested on it for barely a moment before something almost impossible flickered across her face. Not fear. Recognition. She quietly slipped the bracelet into a specimen bag instead of the hospital's standard lost property container. She wrote nothing on the label except a room number. Then she continued working as though nothing unusual had happened. Minutes later, an emergency physician asked whether anyone knew why one patient's injuries looked strangely inconsistent with the reported crash. The wounds suggested advanced protective equipment had absorbed part of the impact. Nobody had an answer. Elena looked once toward the sealed specimen bag but remained silent. Whatever she understood, she kept to herself. Midnight approached, yet the flow of casualties refused to slow. Fatigue settled over every member of staff. Gloves were changed with trembling hands. Coffee grew cold untouched. The hospital's trauma coordinator quietly admitted that if another wave of critical patients arrived, they might no longer have enough personnel to respond effectively. For the first time that night, genuine uncertainty settled over the department. Then it happened. At first it sounded like distant thunder beyond the rain. One helicopter. Then another. Within seconds the vibration intensified until windows trembled inside their frames. Conversation stopped. Doctors looked toward the ceiling. Security officers rushed outside believing another disaster had unfolded nearby. Nurses exchanged confused glances because regional hospitals rarely received even one military evacuation aircraft, let alone several together. The frightened little boy lifted his head. Elena slowly turned toward the ambulance entrance, her calm expression unchanged even as the unmistakable roar of rotor blades multiplied overhead. One after another, 8 helicopters descended through the darkness toward the hospital landing zone, and every person inside the emergency department suddenly realized they were witnessing something no one had ever seen before. The first helicopter had barely settled onto the landing pad before the second descended beside it, then the third, until the night outside the emergency department pulsed beneath a wall of rotating blades powerful enough to shake ceiling tiles loose. Every conversation inside the hospital dissolved into confused silence as physicians, nurses, security officers, and paramedics stared through rain-soaked windows, unable to understand why 8 aircraft had converged on a regional hospital that normally handled little more than traffic accidents and seasonal emergencies. The trauma coordinator hurried outside expecting government officials or critically injured patients, but what stepped onto the pavement instead deepened the mystery. Flight crews wearing different insignias moved with astonishing coordination. Some wore military uniforms. Others carried the markings of international disaster response organizations. A few belonged to civilian air rescue teams from hundreds of miles away. Yet despite their different backgrounds, every one of them asked the same question before anything else. Where is Nurse Elena Carter? Inside, Elena never looked toward the windows. Another patient had begun losing blood pressure, and her attention remained fixed on stabilizing him. She guided a young resident through a difficult procedure with such steady confidence that his trembling hands slowly stopped shaking. She corrected nothing with criticism. Every instruction came quietly, almost gently, allowing him to believe he was discovering the solution himself. Around them, the emergency department strained under impossible pressure. Supplies dwindled. Hallways filled with stretchers. Families prayed in whispers while overworked staff fought exhaustion with stubborn determination. Elena seemed untouched by the chaos. She moved from bed to bed with remarkable economy, never wasting a gesture, never raising her voice above the surrounding noise. One physician finally noticed something that had escaped everyone else. Elena never needed to search for equipment. Before anyone requested a particular instrument, she already had it waiting. Before a monitor alarm became dangerous, she was already beside the patient. It was as though she anticipated emergencies several seconds before they unfolded. Curiosity slowly replaced skepticism. The senior nurse who had dismissed her earlier watched Elena identify a hidden abdominal injury simply by noticing an almost invisible change in a patient's breathing rhythm. Minutes later, a CT scan confirmed every detail of her assessment. Another critically injured woman suddenly began seizing after appearing stable for nearly an hour. Elena immediately recognized a rare neurological complication that most emergency nurses encountered only in textbooks. Treatment began before irreversible damage occurred. No celebration followed. Elena simply washed her hands and continued toward the next patient. Outside, dozens of uniformed personnel entered the hospital with disciplined urgency. But instead of taking control, they waited respectfully near the administrative offices. Their expressions carried neither panic nor authority. They carried expectation. Hospital administrators hurried to meet them, assuming an investigation or inspection had begun. Instead, the highest-ranking officer quietly presented an encrypted identification case and asked to speak with the chief medical officer immediately. Within minutes, the hospital director arrived, visibly confused. The officer opened the case and produced a worn photograph taken years earlier during an overseas humanitarian mission. The woman in the photograph stood covered in dust, surrounded by collapsed buildings and frightened children, calmly directing surgeons beneath a temporary surgical tent. Although her hair was shorter and her face younger, there was no mistaking her identity. It was Elena. The director stared from the photograph toward the emergency department where the quiet nurse continued changing four fluids without the slightest sign that anything unusual was happening. Before he could ask another question, the officer spoke with unmistakable respect. We have been trying to locate her for nearly 12 hours after losing contact during a classified transport operation. Intelligence confirmed she accepted employment here under a civilian contract only last week. We came because if Elena Carter is working inside this hospital, then lives are being saved that no one else could save. Word spread carefully at first, passing between administrators and senior physicians in hushed conversations. Nobody wanted to interrupt active patient care, yet disbelief spread faster than any official announcement. Personnel records were reopened. References that had once seemed strangely incomplete suddenly made sense. Entire years had been intentionally omitted. International assignments had been reduced to ordinary employment descriptions. Awards had never been listed. Commendations had never been mentioned. Confidentiality agreements had hidden almost everything except the simplest facts required for civilian licensing. Meanwhile, Elena remained completely unaware that the walls around her were filling with people who already knew her name. Another emergency erupted when a patient suddenly lost cardiac output following what appeared to be a successful operation. The room exploded into motion. Compressors began chest compressions. Medication doses were shouted across the room. Then everything happened at once. Equipment malfunctioned. A power fluctuation briefly dimmed the lights. Someone dropped a tray of instruments onto the floor. For one extraordinary moment, the emergency department became almost silent. The monitor emitted one long, unbroken tone. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every face turned toward the patient lying motionless beneath harsh surgical lights. Elena stepped forward. She rested 2 fingers lightly against the patient's neck, closed her eyes for barely a heartbeat, then calmly instructed everyone to stop. Her voice was neither loud nor dramatic. It was certain. She ordered one specific adjustment that contradicted standard expectations. A physician hesitated. Elena repeated the instruction only once. They obeyed. Seconds later, a weak heartbeat returned to the monitor. Then another. Then another. Breath slowly filled the patient's lungs again. Relief spread through the room like sunrise after an endless night. No applause followed. There was only exhausted disbelief. The physician who had doubted her quietly lowered his eyes, understanding he had just witnessed a level of judgment few people ever develop in an entire lifetime. As Elena removed her gloves, she noticed the frightened little boy from the waiting area watching through the partially open doorway. She walked over and handed him a warm cup of cocoa someone had forgotten in the staff lounge. He smiled for the first time since arriving at the hospital. She smiled back just as softly before returning to work. Neither of them realized that several officers standing nearby watched the exchange with unmistakable admiration. One whispered to another that she had always done that, even in war zones where supplies barely existed. No matter how desperate circumstances became, she somehow found time to comfort frightened children. Finally, the chief medical officer approached Elena directly. He carried the photograph, now slightly bent from nervous hands. Around them, conversations faded as staff instinctively sensed something important was about to happen. He held the picture beside her face and quietly asked whether it belonged to her. Elena looked at it for several long seconds before giving the smallest nod. She did not seem embarrassed. She simply appeared tired. The officer standing behind the director came to attention without being asked. One by one, every pilot who had arrived aboard the helicopters did the same. Several experienced surgeons who had entered with them followed. Even seasoned emergency physicians looked confused as decorated rescue commanders, combat medics, disaster specialists, and veteran flight crews stood in respectful silence before the newest nurse on the hospital roster. The senior officer finally broke the silence. He explained that the 8 helicopters had not gathered because of the highway disaster alone. They had crossed state lines because intelligence confirmed that one of the most protected medical professionals in modern emergency response had unknowingly reported for an ordinary civilian shift. Elena Carter was not simply an experienced nurse. She was the classified trauma legend who had trained elite rescue teams across multiple continents, rewritten emergency survival protocols still used around the world, and disappeared from public records years earlier after choosing a life where compassion mattered more than recognition. Every skeptical glance from earlier that evening suddenly carried unbearable weight, and as every eye in the emergency department turned toward the quiet woman who had never once asked anyone to notice her, one impossible question remained unanswered. If someone capable of changing the course of disasters had deliberately hidden among ordinary nurses, what heartbreaking reason had convinced her to walk away from a legacy that the rest of the world had never even known existed? The question lingered in the stunned silence long after the helicopters stopped turning and the last echo of their engines faded into the approaching dawn. Every face inside the emergency department remained fixed on Elena, waiting for an explanation that seemed almost too extraordinary to exist. Yet she did not straighten her posture, accept congratulations, or step into the center of the room as though she had been discovered. She simply reached for a fresh pair of gloves, checked the medication chart of the next patient, and asked whether the blood bank had enough universal donor units for the surgeries still ahead. For several seconds no one answered. Doctors who had spent years commanding trauma teams found themselves speechless because the woman they had quietly underestimated had responded to the greatest revelation of her career with the same concern she had shown for every frightened patient since the beginning of the night. The chief medical officer finally spoke, asking the question everyone else was too hesitant to voice. Why had someone with a reputation known only in the highest levels of emergency medicine chosen to disappear into a small regional hospital under an ordinary nursing position? Elena paused only long enough to remove her blood-stained gloves. Her eyes moved slowly across the crowded emergency department, lingering on exhausted nurses with aching backs, interns fighting to stay awake, janitors silently mopping away the evidence of suffering before another stretcher arrived, and families praying without knowing whether anyone had heard them. Then she answered with quiet honesty. She explained that there had been a time when every day of her life belonged to disasters no newspaper could publish and missions no family could ever be told about. She had treated children beneath collapsed schools after earthquakes that governments denied had happened. She had operated inside flooded villages where helicopters landed only once because there was barely enough fuel to leave again. She had trained elite rescue teams to make impossible decisions in impossible places, knowing that every lesson might one day become the difference between life and death for someone they would never meet. The medals came afterward. The classified reports followed. So did the invitations to lead larger operations. But every promotion carried her farther from the people she had entered medicine to serve. She found herself writing policies instead of holding hands, attending briefings instead of comforting frightened families, saving systems instead of saving individuals. One day she realized that the world admired heroes far more than it valued quiet caregivers, and she no longer wanted applause that arrived only after someone else's worst day. She resigned without ceremony, declined every public recognition, signed one final confidentiality agreement, and accepted the first civilian nursing position where no one knew her name. The room remained completely still. Even the constant beeping of monitors seemed softer than before. The little boy from the waiting area slowly approached, clutching his faded blue backpack with both hands. His father had survived emergency surgery and was finally stable enough for recovery. The child looked at Elena with the uncomplicated honesty that only children possess and asked whether she had really saved people all over the world. Elena smiled gently before kneeling until they were eye level. She told him that she had simply met many people on the hardest days of their lives and had tried never to let them face those days alone. The boy reached into his backpack and carefully removed a folded sheet of paper covered in uneven pencil drawings. It showed a helicopter, a hospital, and a woman wearing simple scrubs with a bright smile on her face. Across the top he had written in large crooked letters, "Thank you for helping my dad." Elena accepted the drawing as though it were the greatest award she had ever received. One of the decorated rescue pilots quietly wiped away tears before turning his face toward the window. He remembered another frightened child years earlier in another country handing Elena a flower made from scraps of cloth after she had worked for 36 hours without sleep. She had treasured that gift too. Nothing about her had changed. News of her identity spread through the hospital before sunrise, but it never reached the patients in the way reporters would have preferred. When journalists gathered outside hoping to interview the mysterious medical legend whose arrival had drawn 8 helicopters, they found only a brief statement from the hospital thanking every first responder involved in the night's rescue efforts. Elena had already declined every camera, every interview, and every request for recognition. She quietly asked that the attention instead be directed toward the ambulance crews, volunteer blood donors, emergency dispatchers, maintenance workers who kept the generators running through the storm, and the nurses who would remain long after the headlines disappeared to continue caring for recovering patients. The chief medical officer watched her finish paperwork beside a junior nurse who still believed she had done very little during the night. Without revealing Elena's history, he simply thanked every member of the department for refusing to give up when the hospital had reached its breaking point. Later that morning, the senior nurse who had dismissed Elena on her first shift approached her with visible embarrassment. She apologized for judging someone she had never truly known. Elena accepted the apology before it had fully left the woman's lips. There was no resentment in her expression, only understanding. She admitted that assumptions were easy to make because uniforms rarely revealed the journeys people carried beneath them. Before leaving, she gently placed a hand on the nurse's shoulder and thanked her for staying beside frightened families throughout the night. The apology ended not with shame but with shared respect. As patients gradually stabilized and the emergency department returned to something resembling normal rhythm, the 8 helicopters prepared for departure. One after another their crews assembled outside the hospital entrance. There were no speeches, no ceremony, no medals waiting beneath bright lights. Instead, each pilot, surgeon, medic, and rescue commander paused for a single quiet salute toward the entrance where Elena stood holding the child's drawing in one hand and a fresh patient chart in the other. She returned the gesture with nothing more than a grateful nod before turning back inside because another patient had just pressed the call button. As the helicopters lifted into the bright morning sky, dozens of hospital employees stood watching from windows and rooftops. They finally understood that greatness had walked beside them all night wearing ordinary shoes and carrying no expectation that anyone would ever know. Long after the aircraft disappeared beyond the horizon, the little boy's drawing remained pinned above the nurse's station. New employees often asked why such a simple picture occupied the place where certificates and awards usually hung. The answer never changed. Someone would smile and quietly say that it reminded everyone what the hardest nights were really about. Sometimes the strongest hands are the ones that never reach for applause. They simply reach for the next person who needs them. The hospital eventually returned to its familiar routines, the corridors filled once again with ordinary footsteps instead of history, but those who had witnessed that extraordinary night carried its lesson into every shift that followed. They learned that true greatness often arrives without introduction, speaks softly when others shout, and leaves behind courage instead of attention. And if this story stayed with you, let it be a gentle reminder to look twice at the quiet people around you, because the greatest acts of kindness are often performed by those who never expect the world to know their names.